Welcome back, Dean Obeidallah Show. We're live here Friday, January 3rd. And right now, very happy to have on the show, again, John Bonifaz. He's a constitutional attorney, co-founder and president of Free Speech for People. And they've been doing a great job now talking about Section 3 of the 14th Amendment and how it banned anybody involved engaged in an insurrection. I have him on because last night I talked about this in my monologue. And I wanted John, as the constitutional law attorney, to talk about it in more detail. So, John, nice to see you. Thanks for being on.
Dean, great to be back with you.
So, John, let's take this step by step for people. We won't make this a law school class, but the idea, because your organization worked very hard to disqualify people and enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which we all should. It's the Constitution. And I wanted to get a sense from you, what is an insurrection as contemplated by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment? Because obviously you were banned and disqualified from holding office if you engage in an insurrection. So let's do this piece by piece. What is an insurrection pursuant to the 14th Amendment?
Yes, well, we have to understand, right, that the 14th Amendment was enacted after the Civil War, and the framers of that amendment intended with Section 3 to ensure that people who engage in trying to overthrow the government, as the Confederates did with the Civil War, the first insurrection in our nation's history, that they would be forever barred from holding public office again if they had previously taken an oath to defend the Constitution. So an insurrection, is understood from that time going forward, has always been an effort to overthrow the government, an uprising against the government. And the Colorado Supreme Court, which was the first court to rule that Donald Trump was in fact disqualified under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, made clear that the definition of insurrection clearly encompassed what happened on January 6, 2021, the use of force to try to stop the peaceful transfer of power.
Yes, and they went through, the trial judge in that case, in the Colorado case, went through and took testimony from historians and experts to talk about what it meant. And in the New Mexico case, in Otero County, where they barred the Cowboys for Trump guy, similar thing. And they went through very simple definition through the steps, essentially a semblance of people coming together using force to prevent the execution of a federal law, or in this case, or the Constitution. So there's zero doubt, John, is it fair to say that January 6th was an insurrection as contemplated by the 14th Amendment, Section 3?
Zero doubt. And in fact, not only did the Colorado Supreme Court find this, but so did the Maine Secretary of State through her proceedings on whether or not Donald Trump was disqualified. So did an Illinois judge through a case that we brought at Free Speech for People challenging Trump's eligibility. The only three jurisdictions in the country, Colorado, Maine, and Illinois, to reach the merits of the question of whether or not January 6th was an insurrection and whether Donald Trump was disqualified, all found that he was, in fact, disqualified and that January 6th was, in fact, an insurrection. And the Supreme Court never, challenged that in their ruling in Trump v. Anderson.
Right. And also the last thing, and just doing this step by step. So you've got January 6th, an insurrection. Now you were banned from holding any federal office or even state office if you've engaged that insurrection. What is, from your reading of the cases, what does engage mean? And what did Donald Trump do that fulfilled that requirement?
Engaged in the case of Donald Trump means that you've engaged in helping to mobilize the mob that went down to the Capitol to try to stop the peaceful transfer of power, that you incited that mob, and then in fact, you were participating. And I think we at Free Speech for People argued in our cases that all of this was backed up by his prior actions leading up to January 6th. All of the lies he told about the alleged fraud in the 2020 election, all of the ways he brought people, the mob, to the Capitol on January 6th, his fake elector scheme, all of it combined was an effort to engage in that insurrection and stop the peaceful transfer of power. And that's what the courts found as well. And again, the Supreme Court in Trump v. Anderson didn't touch the merits of that question either.
And that's such an important point. And as I mentioned yesterday when I was doing my open and I wrote about it in my Substack, when the Supreme Court of Colorado looked at the question of engagement in the insurrection, they found that Donald Trump is the insurrection. There is no insurrection without Donald Trump.
Right.
They also pointed out the fact that during the 3-hour attack, Donald Trump knew about it not only did nothing, incited the crowd further with his tweets, and even saying, as Supreme Court of Colorado noted, he was told they want to hang Mike Pence, and he said, well, maybe he deserves it. So he did nothing but make it worse. So, and they said specifically here, I'm just looking at the language that Donald Trump's engagement in this, that he worked to a common unlawful purpose of preventing the peaceful transfer of power. So Donald Trump engaged in insurrection. You know, I'm chatting with John Bonifaz, a constitutional attorney and a co-founder and president of Free Speech for People, an organization that has litigated these cases. From a legal point of view, it is undisputed, folks, not because I'm saying it. I'm a lawyer too, but I haven't litigated these cases. John has. Donald Trump engaged in insurrection as contemplated by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Donald Trump should be disqualified from federal office. That's what the Colorado Supreme Court decided. What did the U.S. Supreme Court decide in March? Can you remind people on that?
Yes, the U.S. Supreme Court, on a very narrow basis, ruled that states cannot enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, that only Congress or the federal courts perhaps can enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. But they were silent, really, on how Section 3 would be enforced, other than to say that the states cannot engage in this. Now, that was a wrong decision in and of itself. We know the states engage in upholding other qualifications or disqualifications for president. They have done so in matters dealing with people who aren't yet 35 years of age and sought to run for president. They've been blocked from the ballot by federal courts. They've done so with naturalized citizens who have sought to run, and you have to be, a citizen of the country, and they have barred that. So this has already happened in prior cases with respect to upholding other disqualifications. But somehow the Supreme Court invented an exception to Section 3 for federal candidates running for office under Section 3. You cannot enforce that in the states. That doesn't, however, answer the question of whether Congress can enforce it. In fact, leaves that question unresolved. And it's clear now that Congress does retain that power to vote on January 6th, not to certify the Electoral College votes for Donald Trump on the grounds that he's disqualified. They, in fact, have a duty to do that if they're going to uphold their own oaths to defend the Constitution.
That's a great way of looking at it, that the members of Congress today took an oath to uphold our Constitution. By waiving an amendment of the Constitution is beyond problematic. It's a way of how your Republican end, because today's the 14th Amendment. Tomorrow it's the First Amendment. It's the Fourth Amendment, the 22nd Amendment, so Trump can seek a third term. If they don't step up now, it emboldens. And as I said to Timothy Snyder on tyranny, that this idea of not just obeying in advance, but you're surrendering. And you're just going to embolden the wannabe dictator or autocrat. That's what history tells us. That's why it's so problematic. I don't care if they lose that fight, but don't waive the issue by not litigating it. And I mean, not in the courtroom, but in the well of the Congress, and let the vote go down. But you raise it for the American people. I mean,
Absolutely.
so do you have any doubt by the Electoral Count Act that they would have an opportunity to raise this even through the new process? I mean, it's a little higher burden, but I believe it's 20%.
It's yes, and in fact, 87 members of the House, 20 members of the Senate could in fact come together and say, we're going to raise this question, we're going to lodge this objection to this candidate based on the fact he's ineligible. There's another important point to highlight, Dean, as you know, which is Section 3 includes, as part of that important provision, a way for a person who is disqualified to have that disqualification waived. And that's by seeking a waiver of amnesty from the U.S. Congress, requiring 2/3 of a vote from the House and the Senate. So if Donald Trump wanted to seek that waiver, he'd have to get 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to pass an amnesty. And in fact, there was amnesty granted to some ex-Confederates after the Civil War. And the fact that he hasn't sought that means that he is disqualified. Section 3 of the Constitution remains in the Constitution, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, and so too does Donald Trump remain disqualified because there has been no amnesty granted, which allows the Electoral Count Reform Act to be implemented here in an important way on January 6th, and for members of Congress to do their duty, uphold their oaths to defend the Constitution.
if Donald Trump is still sworn in on January 20th and this disability or the prohibition is not relieved by way of a two-thirds vote, from a legal point of view, John, is Donald Trump an illegitimate president?
No question about it. He's an illegitimate president, and I'll go further to say that every action he takes will be illegitimate and will be subject to a federal court challenge. The fact is that he is disqualified and by definition has no basis being in that public office. And as an illegitimate president, all of his actions will be illegitimate. Now, the Supreme Court can take up that separate question, of course, and perhaps they will with one or more cases. But suffice it to say that we're putting ourselves in uncharted territory here, where we have a provision of the Constitution that clearly cites what it means to be disqualified under it. He's met that requirement. He is disqualified, and now we're going to waive away that section of the Constitution on January 6th with Congress not enforcing it. That means we're kicking the can down the road, and there will be potentially cases lodged after January 20th challenging his legitimacy as president.
And that's an interesting point. And I had emailed you about who would have standing to do this, because right now Congress, there's no doubt Congress has the power on January 6th, if not even after that, to try to address this issue. The Supreme Court didn't say it has to be implemented before the person sworn in. And as a quick reminder for people, in New Mexico, in that case, with I think his last name is Griffin, the head of Cowboys for Trump, he was in office already. He does the insurrection. They remove him from office in New Mexico. And that case is affirmed by the Supreme Court of New Mexico. So it doesn't mean that if you don't do it on January 6th, you can't do it. So if Congress doesn't do this on January 6th, and I don't have much confidence that they're going to be honest, if they don't, who can enforce it?
Well, any action that the president then takes after January 20th will impact people in different ways. And those individuals or those groups that are impacted by a particular action can challenge that action by the president on the grounds that it was illegitimate under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment coming from a disqualified person in that office. So that's how that case could proceed in many different situations where the president is engaged in taking actions that groups decide to challenge.
I'm chatting with John Bonifaz, a constitutional attorney and co-founder and president of Free Speech for People. I so appreciate that you've laid it out in a way that we can everyone understands, law degree or not, we all get it. And that the conclusion is based on the facts, based on the law, that Donald Trump engaged in insurrection, is thus disqualified from serving as president, and that if he's sworn in on January 20th and there's no vote in 2/3 of the House and the Senate to say we're going to waive this disqualification, he's an illegitimate president. And I've been saying that, and people scoff at me. But thankfully, you're here as a constitutional attorney and can tell me that I'm living in the real world, and I don't know what it. John, I mean, maybe I'm naive, but I thought if you attempted a coup and incited a terrorist attack on our capital, you would go to jail, not be elected a president again with no accountability. And I can't believe that's where we are. And we're facing a man who should be in a prison cell right now, about to be sworn in on January 20th as president of the United States of America.
It's really incredible. Dean, either we have a constitution or we don't. Either it's the supreme law of the land or it's not. And at this stage, what we're dealing with is ignoring a critical provision of the Constitution that's designed to protect the Republic. The reason why the framers of the 14th Amendment put that provision into that amendment is to prevent a situation where those who have taken that oath of office, who then engage in insurrection, could ever hold public office again. And so they didn't want to see ex-Confederates come back into power, and it applies to future insurrections as well. They had that debate. They actually questioned, should they only apply it to this situation, to the Civil War and to the Confederacy trying to overthrow the government, or should they apply it to the future? And they decided to apply it to all future insurrections as well. And that's where we are today. The second insurrection in our nation's history happened on January 6, 2021. And on January 6, 2025, members of Congress who took their oath to defend the Constitution need to uphold that oath and carry out their duty and vote not to certify Donald Trump as president.
And look, the 14th Amendment is one of the most important amendments of the modern era. It's part of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, the three after the Civil War. One banning slavery, the 14th Amendment so many provisions in that are so important for our nation. 15 saying no discrimination based on race for in terms of voting. And the idea of just ignoring the 14th Amendment now, Democrats should be in the media at least talking about it, at the very least, building up support for the idea of voting on January 6th against it. Now it seems like out of the blue. Like why, what are you doing about it? I really believe because if the shoe was on the other foot, if a Democratic president did what Donald Trump did, the exact same facts, and somehow won, I can assure you Republicans would be flooding the media going, this guy can't be sworn in. He's an
Yeah.
illegitimate president if he's sworn in. There's no doubt. And I
Yeah.
don't know why Democrats don't have that fight in them to preserve our Constitution. That's what we're asking. Stand up for the Constitution. You took an oath. Do the right thing.
It's shocking. I mean, look, we're a nonpartisan organization, so we don't look at this through
I
a
understand
party
that.
lens.
Right.
But what I will say is that what we heard going into this election was that Donald Trump is a fascist. We heard that Donald
Mm-hmm.
Trump is a threat to our republic. We heard that Donald Trump is a threat to our democracy. And now it's crickets. We're not hearing that anymore. We're somehow just accepting that because the election occurred, he's no longer an insurrectionist. He's no longer disqualified. It makes absolutely no sense. He was disqualified before the election. He is disqualified after the election. If this had been, let's just imagine, Dean, a situation where a very popular 25-year-old was on every ballot, won the electoral college vote, and was effectively declared president of the United States. Would we now be saying, well, the public spoke, the vote occurred, and let's just throw out that provision of the Constitution that says somebody has to be 35 by the time of the oath. We're going to go ahead and accept what the voters voted for during the election. That's not the way the Constitution works. We don't
Right.
just throw out certain qualifications because it no longer feels politically right to do so. What's politically right is to stand up for the Constitution today and to stand up for our democracy and not, put your finger to the wind and decide you're no longer going to say any of the things you were just saying days before.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I don't know if Democratic leaders understand that they're hurting their own credibility. And I've gone through this on the show, the quotes. Yes, he's literally called a fascist. Vice President Harris said he's a threat to our freedoms and democracy. Joe Biden called him an existential threat to our republic. And all of it's true. They weren't hyping it up. The man attempted a coup and incited a terrorist attack. What they said was true. They were right. But to be silent now is wrong. And it is from expediency. And said you have some Democrats writing op-eds, find common ground. Find common ground with the fascist? I mean, what has happened to us? What? And again, it's not I'm partisan. Your organization is not partisan. I speak as an American who believes in our Constitution, who, as a lawyer, was, studied it and understand the importance of it. And if we're going to just give up on the checks and balances, then we don't deserve a republic. Let's just have a dictatorship. If that's what people want, this is outrageous to me. The silence by Democrats on this.
Well, it's outrageous, and it's also important to remember, right? The 70 plus million people voted against any threat to our democracy. They voted against this fascist, and those millions of people deserve representation. They deserve to
Right.
see resistance to fascism coming into the Oval Office, and they deserve to see resistance to those who want to just sweep away a critical provision of the Constitution. We know what the defenders of Donald Trump and Donald Trump himself say. They say January 6th was an insurrection. They say we're not, going to apply Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. It doesn't apply to this current matter. All of that has been proven to be untrue. The overwhelming evidence, not just the Colorado court and the Maine Secretary of State and the Illinois court, but the House Select Committee that investigated for months all of this. All of this demonstrates that they're wrong and that the history shows that this was an insurrection, that he engaged in it, and that he's disqualified. So there's no way to ignore all that. And frankly, it's shocking that those who just, a couple months ago were saying we have to uphold the Constitution, we have to defend it, are now being silent. It's inexcusable.
I agree. And another thing, John, I mean, in the impeachment resolution after January 6th, it was titled Incitement of an Insurrection. Insurrection, folks. And it cited the disqualifying provision of Section 3 of the 14th
Yes.
Amendment in it and called for losing the being disqualified from holding office. And the majority of the House voted for it. And that same resolution, the majority in the Senate voted for it. And I try to make an argument in my article that the Congress already did act, folks. Both the House and the Senate, a majority of both voted Donald Trump incited an insurrection. He is barred from office. And it means nothing. Not that I expect my article to change the world. I'm delusional, but this is the facts. This is the truth. So we only got about a minute left, John. I want the people to find out what's the website, and we'll have you on more to talk about your 2.0 resistance to Donald Trump, because it's so important that free speech for people are still fighting the good fight and not rolling over and surrendering in political expediency. So what's the website people can go to find out more about the organization?
Absolutely. We invite people to join us in this effort to protect our democracy at freespeechforpeople.org. We're engaged in multiple fronts to defend our democracy, and it requires all of us to stand up at this critical moment in our history.
I could not agree more. John, thank you for your continued efforts and the work at Free Speech for People and not giving in and not making it. It's easier to be quiet. Yeah, it's easier to be quiet and give up your democracy and your self-determination. So thank you, John. Have a great weekend, my friend.
Thank you,
Talk
Dean.
to you
You
soon.
too.